Hey friends, it's time for another Playwright tip, and today we will talk about TypeScript. You might know that you can write and run your end-to-end tests using TypeScript. But do you know that Playwright isn't actually type checking your code? If that's news to you and you still want to rely on this useful type safety, this video is for you. If you're now surprised because the whole purpose of using TypeScript is to rely on type safety, trust me, you are not alone. But it's written black on white here in the Playwright docs. You just write tests in TypeScript and Playwright will read them, transform them to JavaScript and run. Note that Playwright does not check the types. But what does that actually mean? Let's switch to VS Code and find out. I have here a Playwright example project that you pretty much get when you run npm init playwright latest. And the project includes this test case that navigates to playwright.dev, it clicks the get it started link, and then it checks that the heading installation is visible. And because it is a TypeScript file here, when we now put in an obvious error, like changing this assertion to be visible, we will be greeted with the common red squiggly lines from TypeScript telling us that something's wrong here. But let me tell you, this isn't Playwright specific. This is VS Code running TypeScript for me. And this is great for my development experience, but nothing prevents me now from running this obviously broken Playwright test. So let's add a quick log message, hello, and try to run it. So when we now go to the terminal and say npx playwright test, and let's not run it in headed mode, we see that it is failing, but it is still executing our hello. Playwright was compiling this TypeScript code even though it was obviously broken and tried to run it. And this here, property to be visible, not found, isn't a TypeScript error. This is a runtime exception. So there's no type safety when you run your Playwright tests. And you might now say, all right, Stefan, but what's the big deal? I see the squigglies right in my editor. And I say, for a small project, sure, this is fine. But when you're working on a complex Playwright codebase, you really want to fail early. Consider a project with 100 test cases and dozens of page object models, and you change the signature of one function. This could lead to 10, 20, 30 TypeScript errors all over your codebase. And you could now push that to CI/CD, and you will wait 25 minutes only to find out that it will fail because there's an obvious error. Type checking will prevent that. So let's bring that back in and also add TypeScript linting to prevent you from making common Playwright mistakes. As a first step, let's head to the terminal and install TypeScript. So I'll call npm install safe dev TypeScript. Here we go. And that was rather quick. And now we can use the just installed TypeScript compiler to create a new TypeScript config file. Here we have it. And this is now obviously a lot, but you don't have to care about this. Because when we jump back to the Playwright docs, we will find that Playwright, first of all, only supports the paths and base URL. And all these config options we've just seen and the tsconfig are for you to primarily control your TypeScript compiling for application code. So for our purpose, we can just use default settings. Additionally, when you use TypeScript for your application code, you should also put the tsconfig JSON inside of your test directory to not interfere with your overall project settings. In our example here, we will keep it in the root to keep things simple. But let's get back to the setup. Now that we installed TypeScript and created the TypeScript config file, we can go to the terminal and we can call npx tsc for TypeScript compiler, and we pass it the no emit flag here. The no emit flag means that TypeScript will not try to compile the code and spit out JavaScript, but rather it will only do the type checking. So let's run it. And here we go. We have a TypeScript error, and TypeScript is telling us property to be visible does not exist on type make matchers. Did you mean to be visible? We even got a nice hint telling us what we should do. So now that we have our type checking command, we can reshuffle some things and make sure that our code is valid before we pass it over to Playwright. I like to do things in npm scripts, so let's add a test command and we will run Playwright Test from here. Note that when you wrap things in npm scripts, you don't have to call npx, but I don't want to run TypeScript here. I rather want to have another pre-test script in which we then can place our tsc no emit call. So whenever I now run npm run test, this script here, due to the pre-convention, will run first. Let's give it a try and go to the terminal and call npm run test. So here we go. So it now ran first TypeScript to see if the code is all right. And when we now fix our Playwright test case, we can go back here. The squigglies will disappear, but remember, this is only your editor. And now you can npm run test again. And here we just passed perfectly valid TypeScript code to Playwright. And I think this is pretty sweet because you can now avoid passing invalid TypeScript code over to Playwright and spin up headless browsers only to figure out that you have a typo or something obviously broken in your code. But we can do more. Let's remove the console log here and let's look at another test case. It's the same test, but now it includes two very common Playwright errors. The first one is to await synchronous methods. So when you call locators in Playwright, there's nothing actually happening. A locator is just a blueprint, and Playwright will reach into the DOM when you use it with an action like click, or when you use it with web-first assertion. So there's no need to await a locator. Similarly, actions or web-first assertions need to be awaited because there's a lot of auto-waiting going on in these methods. And when you miss an await, you will very often run into the target closed error, which you have probably seen already because sometimes it's very easy to forget an await in complex Playwright scripts. Unfortunately, type checking won't help us out here, but we can bring in a TypeScript linter. And we will go for typescript-eslint, which sits on top of eslint, which is a very common JavaScript linter, but enriched with some TypeScript goodies. And these will help us to write better Playwright code. So let's set these up. And I will be a little bit quicker because the instructions now are described on the TypeScript-eslint getting started page. So first of all, we'll install some more dependencies. So we have here eslint, some types, and TypeScript-eslint. So you see there that there's a little bit of more code now entering the project, but trust me, it will be worth it. Let's then create a new config file, and it will be called eslint config.mjs. And here we're going to paste some default configuration. So we will use eslint's recommended linting configuration, and also from TypeScript-eslint, we're also going for the recommended options. And now we can go to the terminal and we can say npx eslint, and we want to lint all the files that are included in our tests directory. And now we see that there are no linting errors because we didn't turn on the TypeScript goodies yet. So let's do that and extend our config object with some TypeScript magic. And to do that, I will paste some linting rules that I would like to turn on. So here we see TypeScript-eslint, no floating promises. And this linting rule will ensure that you won't miss awaiting a call or a function that returns a promise. So with this rule enabled, TypeScript-eslint will warn you when you're not awaiting your button click or when you're not awaiting expect to be visible. Then we will also turn on the await thenable rule, which means that when you're awaiting something that isn't returning a promise, TypeScript-eslint will also warn us about it. So let's try to lint our files again. And TypeScript-eslint unfortunately is now throwing an error because these rules need to know how to run TypeScript. Luckily, there's an easy fix. So we can go in here and we can say that we want to reuse the tsconfig that is included in the project. And here's the root directory for this project. And now we are ready to go. I hope you are as excited as I am. So let's lint our files again and let's see. And here we go. So it tells us that at line 16, this one, that we shouldn't await this locator call. Cool. And then in line 17, it's also telling us that we have a mistake here because click returns a promise and needs to be awaited. So let's fix these errors and run our linting again. Here we go. And we just added some tooling that will help us to write better Playwright code and introduce fewer bugs. Of course, you could now dive into all these linting rules, but when writing Playwright tests, I found these two to be most valuable. And with that, we are now on the finish line. So let me copy this command here, go back to our package.json. And now whenever we want to call Playwright test using npm run test, we will now type check our Playwright code, and we will also lint our code so that it doesn't include these very common Playwright mistakes. Let's check if this works a final time. So npm run test, and here it's now running type check, it is running the linting, everything passed, and then it was after these 2 steps succeeded running our Playwright tests. And I can only highly recommend for complex Playwright projects to bring in some additional safety to save all these wasted minutes where you're running Playwright only to discover that you made an obvious mistake. And congratulations, we just made it to the finish line. If you want to look at this code that I showed you in this video, we just open sourced a new GitHub repository that will hold all the examples that you will find on the Checkly YouTube channel. But what's Checkly? Checkly enables you to take all your existing Playwright tests and run them on a schedule from around the globe. So you can start monitoring your production environments with Playwright and be the first one to notice when there are issues in production. And I can highly recommend it because monitoring production is the only way to be certain that everything is running properly and that you're not having any issues. And now we're really done. If you have any questions or comments, drop them below, and I will see you in the next couple of weeks showing you the next Playwright tip.